apple to Icarus and his prosthetic wings to the film Limitless, which features a pill that makes you capable of easily mastering the most complicated information. Proverbial magic bullets that modify or extend or enhance our natural abilities and help us overcome our weaknesses, they have been depicted as having great potential to help, but also to hurt humanity in unpredictable ways. And when it comes to truly enhancing performance, of overcoming our limitations, some of the most promising work being done right now is in the area of brain plasticity. Cutting-edge research suggests that a whole arsenal of tools, from video games to brain stimulation to pharmaceuticals, they may make it possible to rewire our brains in ways that take our neural pathways back to their early, childlike states, opening up what are called critical periods. These are periods of development when our minds are most open to learning new things, conferring upon us the ability to master new languages, to pick up a new instrument, to jump higher, to run faster, to overcome debilitating brain injury, to cure depression, possibly reverse autism, slow dementia, and help us focus more deeply. But even with such promising developments, we still do not fully understand the long-term effects of such interventions on the estimated 100 billion neurons and the trillions of synaptic connections within the human brain. So, tonight, we are going to focus on the promise and the perils of this young and evolving science, which seeks to go beyond our all-too-human frailties and limitations by leveraging our brain's incredible plasticity. I'd like to welcome all of the scientists in tonight's program who are doing some fascinating work in brain plasticity, each using a unique tool to experiment with opening up critical learning periods in the brain. John Krakauer joins us from Baltimore, Maryland, where he is the director of the Center for the Study of Motor Learning and Brain Repair at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the director of the Brain Learning, Animation, and Movement Lab. Next, we have Takao Hench, who joins us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he is joint professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and professor of molecular and cellular biology at Harvard Center for Brain Science. And finally, we have Brett Wingeier, who joins us from Burlingame, California. He trained as a biomedical engineer and over the last 2 decades has invented a series of devices aimed at neuromodulation. He is currently the CEO of a company developing a transcranial stimulation device meant to treat depression. Welcome to you all. So Takao, if we can just, to get us going, what are we talking about when we use this term brain plasticity?
Yes, in a very broad sense, brain plasticity is the ability to alter brain function in response to experiences of any kind. But if we step into it a little deeper, as far as the brain is concerned, any ability translates to some molecule or a molecular basis. And brain functions are typically defined by specific neural circuits that must be changed. And experience translates into patterns of electrical activity in the brain. So the general definition I think everyone can appreciate is that repeated experiences will shape the way we think, the way we act, and that's brain plasticity.
Now, John, I gather it's the case that I think we all have this intuition. I don't know exactly where it comes from, but we have this intuition that there are periods when our brains are more susceptible to the brain plasticity that Takao just described. And like later on, as we get older, our brains, I don't know, they kind of harden in some sense and aren't able to respond to the environment with the nimbleness that they might have or the dexterity that they might have when we're young. Is that the case? And what do we know about the periods when the brain is most open to change?
Yeah, I mean, I will definitely talk about this for a moment, although Takao has done sort of seminal work at the molecular and cellular level on this. But I'm particularly interested in how you can sort of have these windows of, the critical period reopened by injury, but now there are also people working on sort of more controlled ways to recapitulate these critical periods later in life, pharmacologically, maybe with brain stimulation.
And so, Takao, what do we know about those critical periods? Are they specific to certain learning tasks? Do they open and close at fairly well-defined moments in the development of a human brain?
Well, we've known about critical periods or the malleability of the brain changing across development for centuries, from Aristotle to Montessori to the present day. And this comes from careful observation of children, infants and children, and their ability to acquire new skills at an astonishing rate.
Do you know an age where that closes?
I think this is an important question. So there are probably myriad number of critical periods is really the important message, that brain function translates to particular circuits that change, whether you're talking about vision or hearing or speaking and so on. And so each one of those could have a slightly staggered window of plasticity. And in fact, there's a sense of hierarchy that perhaps the primary sensory areas, our first filters to the outside world, are shaped earliest and perhaps most stringently, which then feeds into multisensory areas that integrate the different kinds of input and ultimately build up a complex cognitive machine like the adult brain. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there's not just one critical period, and that there are sequential series of these that allow for the complex behaviors that we're capable of.
And Brett, we're going to talk about some of the work that you've done a little later on in terms of trying to manipulate the brain, perhaps harness some of the brain plasticity that we're talking about. But do you consider the task of trying to harness brain plasticity a fundamental science question, or is it an engineering problem? I mean, how much detailed understanding of the brain do we need to have to be able to harness these qualities?
Yeah, you know, it's both, and that's one of the interesting things about this field is, you know, we certainly have ways with technology where we can encourage plasticity, and you know, just to be clear, it's not just with technology that we can do that. You know, as adults, we are all still plastic, and we're not plastic in the same way that our kids are. You know, I watch my kids trying to learn a second language, and it's amazing, and so I feel that very personally. But you know, you know, we're plastic every day, and that we learn things as adults, and we have mechanisms where, you know, if we're particularly emotionally engaged, you know, then we learn things better. Now with technology to encourage and increase plasticity, we're on a journey of learning where we're informed by the basic science, we're informed by the applied science of how do you interact with the brain in a better, more targeted way, and there's a lot of interplay between the fundamental science and what we can do with technology. And in general, you know, any kind of neurotechnology or neuromodulation, whether it's on the medical side or the human potential side, it just gets better and better the more we understand about the underlying mechanisms and change things from, you know, basic science questions to engineering problems where we understand the science.
Yeah, well, I certainly feel your pain on the language acquisition issue. I have started to return to playing piano, and my 17-year-old son also returned, you know, and I can't keep up with him. I mean, he's zooming ahead. He's like 5 pieces in, and I'm still struggling on one before. So there's definitely something going on inside my head that isn't as flexible as I would have hoped it would be. So, John, when we think about critical periods and plasticity, from an evolutionary standpoint, do we have a sense of why it is that the brain is structured in such a way that it goes through these periods? Why is that the route that evolution took?
Well, I mean, there are all sorts of arguments. You know, it's a big job to get to being a fertilized egg to a very large, you know, millions of times larger organism. So there's a job that needs to get done to set the system up and have it respond to experience so it gets set up with the right structure, right? But you don't want that runaway plasticity indefinitely, right? I mean, there are consequences to unbridled plasticity. So it has to be controlled. You know, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And this is a form of plasticity that would not be very good. I mean, just like plasticity and the ability to duplicate in cells, if it goes uncontrolled, you get cancer, right? You could have, you know, analogously, the same kind of problem with dysmorphic tissue, seizure dangers, and all sorts of things like that. You know, the kind of thing that you have to do once you've reached cruising altitude and learn things is not the same big lift as how you have to get to cruising altitude in the first place. So you need to have control mechanisms, homeostatic mechanisms in place to keep this in check. Right? Now, it would be very nice if you could go in and manipulate these negative feedback loops, these homeostatic control mechanisms, so we could open up under controlled conditions. But it makes a lot of sense to me that you don't want these growth environments to be on indefinitely.
Right. So Takao, we are starting to learn, and that's really the point of the conversation we're having here, that there is something new in our understanding of brain plasticity. The older idea that we've just heard is that there are periods when the brain opens and it kind of closes down. But now I gather there's evidence that we may be able to reopen brain plasticity in mature brains, in adult brains. What's the evidence for that, and why do we think that may be the case?
Yes, the novelty and the new insight that has come about, I would say, in the past 20 years is twofold. The cellular understanding of what determines the timing of these critical periods has become apparent. So there are triggering mechanisms. And then likewise, there is a system of molecular brakes which seems to act in an active way to close these critical periods. And it's this insight that's really allowed us to manipulate the timing and to reopen it or extend it into adulthood. And of course, all of this starts with animal models, but in many instances, the findings have been surprising and translatable based on pharmacology that's already out there being used, or with a clever inference of what might be happening in humans as well.
And so, John, you mentioned that injury, traumatic brain injury, can reopen brain plasticity. Why does that happen?
Yes. I mean, you know, first of all, you know, as Takao was also mentioning, we've known a long time that you get most recovery from all sorts of brain injury early in animal models and in humans. Now, you know, I can just mention, we did a very slightly freaky experiment in the mouse where we basically gave a mouse a stroke and then delayed its training, and it never really got back to normal behavior. We found also that if you started the training very soon after the stroke, in other words, you don't wait a week, you wait just a day, then the efficacy of the training was much greater, to the point that you couldn't actually tell the difference between the mouse's reaching before and after the stroke. Now, the really freaky thing is if you did the original experiment and waited a week and then gave a second stroke, in other words, you actually made the mouse worse, but you now didn't wait, you actually recovered completely from the first stroke. So in other words, a very profound demonstration of being able to manipulate a critical period by injuring the brain, right? Now, in terms of why that should be the case, it seems to me only sort of logical.
He could induce a stroke, and apparently they can make rats have strokes. Go figure. Mice, whatever they're using. And he's describing how important it is to heal quickly after the traumatic incident. So gives the rat a stroke, and they're testing the rat that was, I think it was mice. The animal that was healed right away, you couldn't tell the difference between it and other animals, really, as if the stroke never happened. The one that you waited too long, it would never be the same. And then he said there was another group that they studied. We hit them with a stroke again, a second one, after a week of not treating it, and the same thing happened. If they treated it after the second stroke right away, it healed up. Huh.
logical and parsimonious to imagine that there are repair mechanisms in the brain, right? Just like you cut your skin, break a bone, damage neural tissue, there's going to be some repair process set in place that will have some overlap with the kind of processes going on during development. Now, I'm not a molecular biologist by any stretch of the imagination, so I defer to people who doing work at that level like Takao to tell us how much overlap, how much mechanistic sharing is there between the repair mechanisms that are triggered by injury and what's happening during development. But I think you can see that there would be some sort of parsimonious intuition that repair and building might share some underlying mechanisms. Now, again, the degree to which you can exploit this, the way that you can actually potentiate it, or even try and make it happen even if you don't go early. In other words, you have a chronic stroke patient, can you somehow make it look like they're still early after stroke? That's what's very exciting.
But you are saying, I guess, in principle, that incredibly fast intervention in the case, say, of a human who experiences a stroke may make all the difference in the world, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's very ironic. You know, I wrote a whole book about this several years ago, and you can go back over 75 to 100 years of literature in primate and rodent models. And an alien from outer space, I actually say this, would look and go, why on earth wasn't this road taken? Right? Even before we knew the mechanisms. I mean, we essentially, to this day, give homeopathic doses of rehabilitation early after stroke. In other words, if you have a stroke, you'd be better off being a rodent than a human in terms of the care that one currently receives. So I have made a big effort to try and introduce intensities of doses of a particular kind of behavioral intervention early to try and see if humans can have these very dramatic improvements that have been seen going back 100 years in primate models, and, you know, a little less, but nevertheless, dramatic improvements in rodent models. So absolutely, it seems to me that what we have to do is to go much earlier and throw the kitchen sink at patients.
Right. So Brett, you also have been developing tools to manipulate the brain in a manner that would help reopen critical periods, not through pharmacological interventions, which we'll talk about in a little more detail in a moment, not through brain injury, but through brain stimulation. So can you tell us a little bit about through the brain?
Absolutely, it seems to, and, you know, a little less, but nevertheless, dramatic, going back 100 years in primate models, and, you know, a little less, but nevertheless, dramatic improvements in rodent models. So absolutely, it seems to me that what we have to do is to go much earlier and throw the kitchen sink at patients.
Right. So Brett, you also have been developing tools to manipulate the brain in a manner that would help reopen critical periods, not through pharmacological interventions, which we'll talk about in a little more detail in a moment, not through brain injury, but through brain stimulation. So can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what you found?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I answer that, I just want to echo what John was saying there. You know, it's absolutely true that in rehab, you know, the dosing is way off, and there's the potential to have so much more powerful effects from a proper dose and really immersing in that rehab. And, you know, again, going back to the example of why our kids can learn piano so much faster than we can. Part of that is because of plasticity, and part of that is because at that point in life, you're able to just be so much more immersed in it. But that makes a powerful statement as to, what kind of training and, in the stroke model, what kind of rehab is really appropriate. But then, to get back to neuromodulation, yeah, I've spent about 2 decades now building technology to stimulate, to enhance, to treat the brain, mostly on the medical side. I've worked in epilepsy, done some work in Parkinson's disease, cluster headache, and now at Magnus Medical in a new treatment for depression. But then on the plasticity and human performance side, at a company called Halo Neuroscience, and the mechanisms behind plasticity are complex, and they're better understood by my colleagues Takao and John here. But because there's this electrical component to brain activity, and an electrical component to creating plasticity and we think enhancing plasticity with neurostimulation, electrical neurostimulation, whether it's pulses that are timed or waveforms that are geared to interact with this underlying brain activity. It's possible to modulate plasticity. Now, with anything with the brain, the effect size can be small, it can be moderate, and it has to be paired with the right training activity to be effective.
Right. And so, like, how strong are these electrical signals? I gather they must be minute, but at a sufficiently high level that the brain actually feels something.
Yeah, and neurons are very sensitive detectors of electrical fields because that's how that's how neurons work. Cell membranes are amazingly sensitive. Now, that at the micro scale, you don't need a lot of energy, but at the macro scale, you step back and you're interacting with the brain, let's say through a wearable device. Well, you need a certain moderate amount of electrical current or electrical field. If you're doing it magnetically, then you need strong, fast current pulses to induce the right fields in the brain and so on. But at the micro level, neurons are amazingly sensitive.
Yeah. So, John, you've also developed a wearable device that, as I understand it, is meant to try to be a therapeutic regimen for stroke victims, where they play a kind of video game where they use their arm to direct the motion of a dolphin. I'd like to talk about that, but let me just show the audience a brief clip so they have a sense of what that game is all about.
The way the experience works is the 3D tracker tracks your body position and it tracks your hand, and we're able to map kind of any direction you're pointing or moving in, whether it's come here or go far or go up or down, into the animal. So you can literally control it in any kind of way within the entire 3D space. I Am Dolphin 2 is a neurorestorative neuroanimation experience that we built, which exploits the residual nervous system after brain injury through a combination of high intensity, high dosage, and something which we call dexterity or creative exploration, which we think engenders a kind of cortical stimulation or brain stimulation that helps recovery. So the game is you embody a dolphin. It's kind of simple in the sense that it's a series of battles or dogfights you do with fish and sharks. But what it's really designed to do is give you the sense that you've become a dolphin, that you've kind of jacked into its motor system. You're learning the dynamics of the dolphin and exploring in its world. How you move becomes a kind of foreign puzzle where you're trying to understand the physics of the dolphin, the hydrodynamics of the water. And when you learn that, you're able to then target fish and sharks and eat them. If we lose the functionality or the ability to do something because of brain damage, how can we get to a state where we're exploring again, where we're learning again?
So, John, I just want to get a sense of your motivation for this game. Is it coming from more or less what Brett was saying regarding immersion into an activity? Is that the power of video game technology?
This is a long story. I'm going to try and compress it.
Yes, thank you.
I think that this game represents the confluence of multiple observations in humans and in animal models. One way to think about it is that there's been 75 years of work on what's called enriched environments. In other words, you put rodents in a cage full of ramps and balls and toys and friends and places to explore. You get multi-scale changes in the nervous system and the rest of the body, okay? One. But that notion of enrichment, which is still very much investigated, but it's an emergent phenomena. You can't zero in on just one thing to explain it. It's a multi-scale phenomena. Has never really been tried in humans, surprisingly. Second, as I said before, you need to do much higher doses and intensities of particular kinds of training, because you need to sculpt the plasticity, especially in this post-injury critical period. You need to make it enjoyable and social. I mean, That's very important too. So you're immersed. So the question was, how do you translate the enriched background and the high intensity, high training foreground into a simple experience that takes somebody out of the reality of their injury? All right. So, and then of course there's this notion, most importantly, of combining cognitive challenge, cardiovascular exercise, and skill learning simultaneously with a full body experience. Now there's a lot of I can say about this, but basically that was the idea, is you have to find a way of doing a training regimen that has all those factors, that is focused on capacities of the nervous system, not on tasks of everyday living. Because you want to avoid the curse of task specificity, which is what happens when you learn particular tasks. So you want to sort of trick the system into upgrading general capacities.
That's what I've been
All right.
doing.
And you're more likely to be able to do that in a critical period than outside, because outside of a critical period, the muted plasticity almost always is task specific. All right. So that was the idea. All right. An immersive environment, recapitulating animal data, making you be both cognitively, motorically, and physically challenged, and then do it at high dose and high intensity.
And have you been able to take patients like within a day or two after suffering a stroke and put them into this environment? Have you done that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did a pilot study, first of all, trying to do this in the current healthcare system and offer many more hours in addition to regular rehab is a massive challenge. So in fact, in our pilot study, which ended up showing that dolphin was twice as effective as a regular rehab, right? We had to do it at about 3 weeks post-stroke, which is when in our other work, the window begins to perhaps close a little bit, but it was just logistically too difficult to give that much. I mean, they're covering, it was an hour in the morning, hour in the afternoon, time on task, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. Imagine having a squash lesson twice a day, every day, 5 weeks for 3 weeks. Okay, so we did it, but it was after they'd been discharged from acute rehab. In New Zealand now, we have a much larger trial ongoing where they are being enrolled after about a week of their stroke. So that's very exciting. But that's going to take, you know, we've only had about 22 patients enrolled. It's a 150 patient study. But yes, the patients can tolerate it, they love it, and it's effective. Okay, and I think we're going to hit a tipping point where these kind of immersive technology-inflected interventions will take the burden off therapists to have to try and give such high intensities and high doses and allow them to do what they're good at, which is just to learn compensatory strategies to do task by task.
So, Takao, we're going to talk about your pharmacological interventions in just a moment, but I want to just stick on this theme of immersion. Do you also, in your work, find evidence that the kind of immersive experience that both Brett and John are talking about is also vital to plasticity from your perspective?
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just our work. So if we think about children, they are very plastic and they learn things very quickly. But the reality is that immersion and attention, arousal, are extremely important components of this. And so in work that was done at the University of Washington in Seattle, for example, infants were brought into the laboratory, American infants who spoke English at home, to interact with a native Chinese speaker. And it was found that those children in their critical period, several months of age, were able to acquire, or more accurately, retain the ability to hear native Chinese speech sounds with a fairly modest amount of exposure, 30 minutes, 3 times a week, 4 or 5 weeks. But what was so brilliant about that study was that they also filmed and audio taped the sessions. And they had 2 other groups of children who were brought in to only hear the audio tape or watch the DVD, essentially receiving exactly the same input that the children who had the live interaction were getting. And neither of those groups were able to discriminate native Chinese speech sounds after the same amount of exposure. And so the manner in which the infants are exposed, that serve and return interaction, which is somehow rewarding to them in the live setting, was instrumental. And so there's an active component of motivation, arousal, and attention that seems to be important even in the most plastic moments during the critical period. So it's no wonder then that John's approach in the adult post-critical period brain requires all this effort.
I wonder what implications that might have for things like online education and even doing programs like this in sort of a digital delivery system, but we'll put that to the side for the moment. Fascinating study, the one that you just mentioned, Cal. But Brett, a few years ago, as you mentioned already, you were developing a device called Halo, which, as I understand it, was a stimulation device that the user would wear. And in that setting, it wasn't so much therapeutic, right? I gather it was to try to enhance the performance of, was it athletes? I think that was one of the applications. What did you find there? And are there concrete results that you can point to showing the efficacy of stimulating the brain when trying to learn to do something?
Yeah. So that device was called Halo Sport, and it was a brain stimulator for athletes and musicians, but really anybody who was engaged in training to have better movement, and that goes beyond just athletes and musicians certainly. But the underlying technology was transcranial electrical stimulation, so specifically a type called transcranial direct current stimulation. And that puts a small electrical current on the surface of the head, and enough of that makes its way through the scalp and through the skull that it changes in a uniform way. It changes the electrical fields around the neurons. And there's still some learning yet to be done around what exactly the mechanisms are. But part of plasticity is this saying that when neurons fire together, they wire together. Now, if you dive in a little bit more specific way, there's certain timings of one neuron firing and causing an output in the postsynaptic neuron, and when you shift that timing around to some extent, then you can modestly increase plasticity, and that's a lot of the underlying mechanism. Now, there were great results, not just from us at Halo, but from some colleagues in academia doing similar things. One of the best studies in improving movement. It was a study from the UK that looked at what you call motor synergy and motor sequence, and basically your ability to fire the right muscles at the right time and the right amounts together, and then to string that together into a sequence of movements. Which, there are all these parallels to music. Motor synergy is making the chord, and then motor sequence is stringing together the chords in the right sequence. So there's a body of work that shows in good sham-controlled studies shows together and then to string that together into a sequence of movements. Which there are all these parallels to music. Motor synergy is making the chord, and then motor sequence is stringing together the chords in the right sequence. So there's a body of work that shows in good sham-controlled studies shows nice results, and shows that we can increase plasticity. But I've said the word moderately a few times, and that's because so much about how something like this works, it depends on careful, rigorous training. It depends on training thoughtfully, so that you're training the right things, and you're not. I think John phrased it better than I am here. But when you're engaged in trying to increase plasticity so you can have some effect on learning, then whether that's through a rehab program or whether it's with a brain stimulation technology that modulates plasticity, you want to make sure that you're improving in a thoughtful way, pairing it with good training, and creating more global capability instead of something that's maybe a very task-specific adaptation.
So, and I read somewhere, and I'm sure you can tell me the details, that some professional football players use it. I guess some from maybe even the Oakland Raiders. And there's one study I read where one player increased the vertical jump that he was able to attain dramatically. Is that? Do you point toward something like that as the evidence for how powerful this can be?
Yeah, so on the sports side, there was we had great data from the U.S. national ski and snowboard team. They did a sham-controlled study with the ski jumpers, and one thing that they do, they're great scientists over there. They instrumented everything, and they do a training program where you're doing a vertical leap that simulates the conditions right at the lip of the jump, and how powerfully and how smoothly you do that. It has a lot to do with how much distance you get in the jump. So that was there were reliable increases in both the smoothness and the power of the jump. What in football, the metric that as you say, folks were trying to increase was vertical leap. And again, it seems like a very simple thing. It's actually great to train on because it's so measurable. And again, it's not just the raw power. It's not just the muscular output. And here's where the neural component comes in. It's the power and the smoothness and how you fire everything in the right sequence to do an amazing vertical leap. The player who had such dramatic results, his name was T.J. Carey, and he's a player for the Raiders, and he dramatically increased his vertical leap. But the thing to highlight there is he did that by being really thoughtful about his training, measuring his outcomes. He was very immersive about it, and all of these things, whether it's improving performance plastically with neuromodulation or just in the natural state, it's thoughtful practice, it's immersion, and all these things that come together so that your brain can learn.
And so from the outside, and pardon me if this sounds critical, I'm just wondering, it sounds like a very coarse approach to manipulating the brain, to just have some vague electrical stimulation that's on the surface of the head. Is it as coarse as it sounds? Are we at sort of such an early stage? Will at some point we direct that stimulation in a more precise manner, or is it just enough to have some overarching vague stimulation and that's all that the brain needs to respond in the ways that one would want?
Yeah, so we're certainly there's a lot more to understand, and the in particular about how do we better target any kind of brain intervention. But the key here is that the focality doesn't come from carefully placed transducers or electrodes or whatever. The focality comes from the interaction between the broader effect and the exact training you're doing. So you're inducing an effect in a portion of cortex where you're making it moderately more plastic, and and then you're pairing it with focused training that's exercising exactly the neurons and the synapses and the networks that are causing your effect and that are key to what you're doing.
Yeah. So Takao, just following on this theme of plasticity and learning, I mean, how well do we understand the molecular processes that you made reference to earlier when it comes to the brain's ability to, say, learn new languages or learn how to play an instrument, right? And how can we apply that molecular understanding to sharpen the capacity to reopen critical periods?
Right. So, of course, those examples which you listed are very complex behaviors, which, as I said earlier, are probably the endpoints of a series of plastic events. And so a lot of the work has been done in the very first or earliest types of critical periods, such as the ability to see through two eyes, and understand why a lazy eye early in life might lead to the permanent loss of depth perception, for example. And these models can be studied in animals where it's possible to investigate the cellular mechanisms involved. And so the interesting findings have been that there are particular types of cells that are especially important in determining the time windows of plasticity, and their maturation is what opens them. And brake-like factors are layered on top of those circuits. And we've talked a bit about electrical activity in the brain. Well, That's really the consequence of the fact that there are only two types of neurons, excitatory and inhibitory cells, whose dialogue is generating those electrical impulses. And so these approaches of applying a current from outside the brain are tapping into these kinds of fundamentals of neuroscience. But the brake-like factors, interestingly, raise other cell types of interest as well. I'll just go back, if it's okay, to the issue of neuromodulation. In the brain, that translates to chemicals like dopamine, acetylcholine, norepinephrine. And this is a kind of third player that's layered on top of excitation and inhibition, and it adjusts the gain or the communication between such cells. And interestingly, video games are almost perfectly optimized to engage these neuromodulatory systems. They're eminently rewarding and they grab your attention, and players are fully immersed. That's what we mean by immersion as far as the brain is concerned. And so, interestingly, we've discovered that there are brake-like factors on the receptors for, say, acetylcholine, which dampen the response of neurons to these chemicals. And so if you remove this brake, then in fact the adult brain remains as attentive as in the juvenile or immature stage. And so that was done through genetic tricks in mice, but it led to a fairly obvious experiment that if you, in fact, can boost acetylcholine, have it linger longer, for example, in the brain, then perhaps you could override that brake. And there are drugs that do that, such as acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, drugs that prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine. And this, in fact, improves plasticity in the paradigm of a lazy eye, for example, something which we've taken from the mouse to clinical trial at Boston Children's Hospital to try and treat patients who are older than the age of 10 to recover binocular vision.
And so these are patients, if I understand, for whom, for whatever reason, one eye was not functioning properly during a critical period for the brain to understand signals that the eye is presenting to it. And because of that, that eye, even when it's functioning properly subsequently, doesn't yield the inner experience that we're used to from functioning vision. And you're saying that that is something that you've been able to reverse through opening up a critical period later on?
Right. So the strategy was to extend this window of plasticity into older individuals. Previous dogma would have said that it's once and done in childhood, and this would be impossible. But the discovery that there are active brake-like factors to prevent the engagement of plasticity allowed us to do this experiment, first in mice, and then attempt a therapeutic approach in humans.
And have you gone beyond lazy eye syndrome? Are there instances where both eyes weren't functioning for whatever reason during a critical period, and then they were able to function later on? Can you open that critical period and restore the capacity for normal vision?
If you've lost vision entirely early in life, that's a much more severe situation where damage has happened to the nervous system and would require more effort to try and restore. But ultimately, a plastic window will be called for to get to that point.
And so John, when it comes to video games, which perhaps to someone watching this program, they might be surprised at the number of times we've made reference to them. I mean, as most parents, when my kids play video games, I have an intuitive reaction that they're wasting their time and they should be doing something else. And so your work certainly has made clear that they can play a role in therapeutics, but do you think they might even play a role beyond that in terms of enhancing healthy brains, taking them to a place that they might not otherwise be able to get?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I mean, first of all, I mean, as Wittgenstein wrote, it's very difficult to define what a game is, right? And I don't think the very same parents who worry about video games, they're not going to be worried if their children engage in a sport or physical exercise. But once you develop a video game that is actually a new form of sport or exercise, which ours is, I think that concern goes away. I think a addictive app on a phone is a very different thing from an immersive new kind of sport. Okay. And the distinction between a sport, a game, and an exercise is interesting, right? But they're not the same. Okay. So once you start thinking that way, you can dispense with most of the concerns that people have, in my view. Now, in terms of healthy, I mean, we've completed a pilot study of the MindPod dolphin in an assisted living facility outside Baltimore for healthy aging, because we know that being engaged cognitively and physically is good to maintain health after the age of 65, if not before, obviously. So there, yes, and we have signal. It leads to both physical and cognitive benefits. It's pilot data, but I'm sure that, you know, knowing that the WHO have reported that up to half of everyone over 65 worldwide does no physical or cognitively challenged activity of any kind.
I'll pause for just a second. Nah, pause the thing I was listening to. I want to find a spot to put this that isn't, you know, where it's behind the locker.
Just shove it behind the locker. I'll find it.
It's not a bad idea.
Just get it up
And
on
then
the
I gotta
bed.
go take a. I gotta go take a leak. Oh, you went up there with the girl. Keep an eye on her. Thank you, dear.
No, I'm okay. Whoop, you fell. Hi there, sweetie. Aw, big yawn. There you go. You don't have anybody to help clean your face yet.
Mama's a face picker.
Yeah, I had to get a hard stuck eye boogie. You see that?
That is a big eye boogie. Damn. Feel a bit better?
She's so warm.
Mm-hmm. We've been sharing one. Snip. I know my big face is scary. But the fingers and the arms, you remember the arm? Oh my gosh, she's already forgotten. That could be a good toy that was getting in my
Where's their toys? Where's their stick toys? They're all in here? Oh, you're it's way too small.
hair.
What do we got? Let's try this one. Whoop. You're so close. Thank God he had his nails trimmed the other day. Hi, sweetheart. It's okay. My love, we have 16 more months for her to grow. Look at her. Basically. Honestly, they're not supposed to be removed from their mother till 12 weeks, but Josh, look at her. Look at her. Look at her. Josh. She'll be ready for her second round of shots soon. Oh, yeah. Gotta go slowly. She's just a baby. Aww. Her little walking around. You're so cute. Laser? Josh. Josh. Mm. Oh my god, her pattern is so pretty. Oh my god. Oh yeah. The little stuck. We have to teach her not to claw our furniture. Did you happen to fix the carpet or no? The rug with tape. This one. Well, I need to retape it. What would happen if I put you on the floor? Look at her compared to Yin, bro. I won't hesitate to spray your butt too. Alright. His little flailingness. You know, I've been thinking about like the way the lady fucking picked up Phoenix to put him in the crate and how he was just fucking flailing for so long.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just makes me think a little weird. I
Yeah,
know
I
he's
wouldn't
probably
say that she was careless, but she wasn't very cool the way she did.
yeah, and stuff just makes me suss on how she treated him.
Fair enough. There's probably a lot of really
Why
bad
he was
cat
so shy and shit. Yeah. Yes. This feather is big as her. It's as big as she is. Try one of the little ones. No, the other one. The other spring. Yes. Take it with your finger and just flick it. Poor thing. But this one just for you, honey. I got this one just for you. I'm watching you. Y'all are gonna play nice or not at all. She's just a baby playing, Flo. It makes me realize that Flo is not a baby anymore. He is not a baby anymore. Yeah, your butt got sprayed because you're gonna be a mean butt. Come here, honey. Come play on the mats. Oh, she's okay. Baby. Look at her. You can't chew on that, baby. You're gonna break the fucking string. Yeah, twins said no, no. Come here. Look at all these toys. You hungry? You want wet food? I have to be spending so much more money on cat food. Yeah, I usually use the spare bowl as the dry food bowl. Where? Here. You can go get me that cat food spoon.
Right? So there's an epidemic of just being unchallenged physically and cognitively at a certain point. So to that degree, I think that there should be an immersive experience on every high street. Now, how one starts to talk about the younger generation and how to develop these experiences challenged physically and cognitively at a certain point. So to that degree, I think that there should be an immersive experience on every high street. Now, how one starts to talk about the younger generation and how to develop these experiences to sort of enhance going to school, enhance going onto the football field, you know, that's an open question, but I would be very surprised if we don't start to do better with VR, AR, immersive activities across the spectrum of human life, health and in disease. It seems to me obvious. You just want to make sure it's a race to the top and not a race to the bottom.
Yeah, well, that actually was my next question. My next question was, look, and we're going to talk to Cal in just a moment about the pharmacological approaches to opening critical periods, but we've made reference to drugs playing a role and electrical stimulation, magnetic stimulation playing a role. If
So tiny. Carter, I'm so tiny.
opening critical periods and immersive experience is such a powerful combination, it would seem that virtual reality is the real place where you'd have the greatest coming together of those forces. So have you tried that? Have you had a virtual reality immersive experience as opposed to just the flat video game?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, yes, we've absolutely played with.
Oh, man. Hannah, look at this. Oh, come on. There we go. So I bend over. I changed the quality of the video. It's like, or it just sharpened up or something. It's not its sharpest. Hey, okay.
God damn it, you gotta put the lid on that motherfucker.
And that's in the camera view.
Yeah, you can't do that.
My bad. Okay. Did any fall out?
No.
Alright, well,
Not a lot anyway.
only a smidgen.
Nobody knows what it is.
True. Oh. Alright, so real quick, what's funny? So I was picking up food and she walks under me and I sweep a back leg. I feel bad.
You should put in your tags, hippie girlfriend.
Okay, I will. I'll do that for you. Don't. I'll do that. That's a good idea. And it's your idea too. I like that. All right, last. This is terrible. This is just absolutely horrible to watch. Just walk by. Kittens and hippie girlfriends. That's Hannah's. That's gonna work. Hey there, Missy. You want to come up to see me again? You want to climb? Oh, I startled. I'm a little too.
The virtual reality version. I have mixed feelings about what's more immersive. In fact, large screens, some people have looked at this, are just as immersive as VR. VR can lead to, cyber sickness. In medical environments, having those goggles on can be problematic. People don't like having them on for hours and hours, which is the doses that we gave in our trials. When you have the screen, you can also have someone coaching you. You can have family members watching. So in other words, you're trading off on other things. There is a slight infatuation with VR. I think it is going to have its moment. I'm actually more interested in AR, where you can actually layer things on top of reality, so you can get the best of both worlds. In the end, I'm agnostic to the empirical data, what the best form of immersion is. But you're absolutely right. I think the key point you made is this combination of non-invasive stimulation, pharmacology, and immersive training experiences is really going to be very multiplicative. And I think that it is the future, both in health and disease, and it's very exciting. And of course, VR will begin to have the killer app once we get these ingredients right.
Yeah, and just to jump in there for a second, and kind of echo, John, what you're saying. There is a lot of excitement around VR, and it's a cool technology. I think real reality is still more immersive than virtual reality. The fact that you can watch a movie on your phone with a 4-inch wide screen, and you can get emotionally engaged and cry at the ending. You can get emotionally engaged with the characters in a video game that you're playing on a monitor. The fact that can happen, it means that our brains are so powerfully good at having that kind of immersive response to any kind of content, if it's the right content. And that's the key challenge is having that content, having immersive, engaging emotionally, physically, cognitively engaging content, that's a challenge in any medium. And it's one of the core challenges of VR is it's great in theory, but it all has to be based in the content and also the experience fitting into somebody's life and carving out the time to use the technology and having being able to put together that whole picture.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd just like to add one.
Yeah, please.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead,
I just
John.
want to add one thing that's really important here, which is there are two ways to think about these immersive environments. One is by recruiting these neuromodulatory systems and attention and emotion. They're actually having a direct gain effect on plasticity mechanisms themselves. In other words, that's one way that these environments seem to be working. They are actually jacking in to the gain on the plasticity mechanisms, like Takao mentioned, right? The other thing these immersive environments are doing is they're just making it more fun to keep time on task and to practice longer, right? Now, it just turns out that to get good at anything, you have to practice a lot. And the vast majority of people on Earth never practice anything very much, right? Now, that's okay. That's why we admire athletes and musicians, people who've just spent all that time at sacrifice of everything else to actually become expert at something, okay? Now, what I've been arguing and others is that unfortunately, if you have a brain injury, or maybe even if you're aging, you're going to have to become an expert in your attention to that deficiency, right? Not the low levels of rehab people usually get. So then the question is, how do you provide the incentive to have to do the absurd amounts of practice that healthy experts do, but you're going to have to do it just because you're now injured, right? And what we're arguing here is that through the combination of pharmacology, stimulation, and immersion, you can do the levels of practice that are going to be required to have an effect, and that there are two mechanisms in play here, just sheer time on task and these modulating effects on the plasticity itself. It's extremely important to understand that these two things are happening at the same time.
Absolutely. So, Takao, let's now turn to that interplay between time on task, as John describes it, and the requirement of putting in the effort to gain the expertise, and the relationship to that to pharmacological interventions. And just to get us going, some in the audience may recall the film Limitless, right? A film in which, if you recall, Bradley Cooper and other characters, they take a pill, right? A single pill that suddenly allows them to use, 100% of their minds, making them like super smart. And the film was demonstrated at one point by one character not putting in the time of tasks that John referred to, but rather one character takes the pill and reaches an absolutely stunning intellectual achievement. Let's take a quick look.
When he told me about this amazing new drug, I was like down the hatch, and it was amazing. I read Brian Greene's The Elegant Universe in 45 minutes, and I understood it.
Well, there you go, right? Reading my book in 45 minutes and understanding it, right? My mom put in 45 minutes, got to the acknowledgments, and that is as far as she wanted to go. But the serious question, of course, is, Takao,
I got here one more time. Just,
turn to that interplay between time on task, as John describes it, and the requirement of putting in the effort to gain the expertise, and the relationship to that to pharmacological interventions. And just to get us going, some in the audience may recall the film Limitless, right? A film in which, if you recall, Bradley Cooper and other characters, they take a pill, right? A single pill that suddenly allows them to use, 100% of their minds, making them like super smart. And the film was demonstrated at one point by one character not putting in the time of tasks that John referred to, but rather one character takes the pill and reaches an absolutely stunning intellectual achievement. Let's take a quick look.
When he told me about this amazing new drug, I was like down the hatch, and it was amazing. I read Brian Greene's The Elegant Universe in 45 minutes, and I understood it.
Well, there you go, right? Reading my book in 45 minutes and understanding it, right? My mom put in 45 minutes, got to the acknowledgments, and that is as far as she wanted to go. But the serious question, of course, is, Takao, you know, what are we able to do with drugs, with pills, in terms of reopening these critical periods, making the brain more plastic?
Yes, so the approaches that have been working so far are, I would say, opening a permissive gate for learning, but you still have to put in the work. And so we have done a very interesting study with colleagues at the University of British Columbia, where, inspired by animal research, where we lifted the brakes on epigenetic controls. So I can explain that a bit more. The idea is that critical periods might eventually wind down because gene programs are closed and no longer available for plasticity. So one strategy was to open them again with a pharmacological tool. And there are such drugs which are actually used clinically for mood disorders. And if we give such drugs to adult rodents, for example, we can rescue their lazy eye condition, for example. So because the drug is clinically safe and well tested, we were able to design a study of just 2 weeks of exposure to the drug or a placebo unbeknownst to the subjects. And during that time, we had them go online and try a variety of critical period type tasks, such as discriminating native from non-native speech sounds, or identifying individual monkey faces, which babies and children can do well because they care, but as adults we don't care as much, and they're all lumped into one category. Another was absolute pitch, the ability to detect the pitch of a note without a reference tone. These are skills that if you don't acquire them before the age of 7, you would lose. And so some languages like Chinese, relying on tones, retain a high level of absolute pitch capability, or musicians certainly who've been training since childhood. But the average adult who hasn't had that experience cannot acquire absolute pitch after those ages. And so with just 2 weeks of exposure, thankfully, perhaps, we discovered that the adult brain is very tough to change. And even if they were on this epigenetic drug, not much was altered, except we found absolute pitch performance improved. And these were subjects who had no multilingual background or musical experience before, and so highly unusual to see with just 2 weeks of training. And this forced us to go back and see why is this possible. And we think that perhaps the absolute pitch was the most stringent in its design, perhaps inadvertently. And it might be well worth revisiting a language task if you want to learn a second language, or the ability to hear a second language with more stringency. And the point is that these pharmacological tools are really just opening the gate for intensive training. And as was mentioned before, this is what gives the specificity of the outcome.
And which drugs are, I mean, is this like Prozac, Paxil? I mean, antidepressants, is that what?
Right. So the drug in this particular study is a histone deacetylase inhibitor, which is a mouthful, but valproic acid was used. And it's used in mood disorders, in fact. So these otherwise healthy individuals, in fact, for safety reasons, were also sampled in their blood content, but also answered questionnaires about their mood, among other possible side effects. And even their mood improved significantly being exposed during this trial. So they are clinically available drugs already. And of course, we can probably do better with more specific versions in the future.
And so do you envision a time when, if an individual wants to learn something new, you know, an instrument, a language, mathematics, physics, whatever, they'll pop a few pills before they go into the class in order to absorb the material more fully?
Well, certainly this possibility is out there, and I'm sure many college campuses are already dealing with this kind of situation. There is most recently in this category of thinking the use of psychoactive drugs as a way to reopen critical periods. There was a very nice study from Hopkins, in fact, that published evidence of a social critical period in rodents, and that this window could be reopened by the drug MDMA or ecstasy. And so this is not to advocate rampant drug use, but it's to show a proof of principle that with a very well-measured, hypothesis-driven approach, we might be able to tap the neuromodulatory systems that are dampened with age through this enhancement. But that alone is not going to produce plastic change. It requires the training to go with it.
Absolutely. So Brett, sticking with this theme of mood disorders and their relationship to brain plasticity, I know some of the more recent work, I guess you may be doing this right now, you made reference to it, you've been working with a company to take your transcranial direct stimulation as a therapeutic tool, I gather, for depression. Can you tell us what's that about, how you're going about it, and what you found so far?
Yeah, so there's a company called, so just to be clear, there's a company called Flow Neuroscience, which is carrying forward Halo's technology, which is transcranial direct current stimulation, and they're working on using that in psychiatric disease like depression. Now, my current company is Magnus Medical, and at Magnus we're using a different kind of brain stimulation, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's an electromagnetic coil. It looks kind of like a figure eight. That's the physical layer, so to speak. But like any kind of neurotechnology, the key is where are you stimulating, and what is the pattern that you're stimulating with. And what we're working on bringing to the world is some technologies that was developed at Stanford University called the SAINT treatment, which is it's powerfully effective because of a combination of personalized targeting. That's you use functional MRI to figure out exactly which part of the cortex of the brain is most closely connected to the deeper networks that are associated with the symptoms of depression. And then you stimulate that with a series of pulses and session timing and whatnot that powerfully leverages the underlying neuroscience. And in the data to date, including a good randomized controlled trial, it's 80 to 90% remission after 5 days of treatment in folks with really very medication-resistant depression.
And does that last? Have they followed that over a sufficiently long period of time?
Yeah, so there's good data out to the 6-month point, and for many, depression is episodic. So for many people, that pushes them out of episode, and they're well. Either in the long term or until the next episode. There's a population that relapses faster, and we're gathering data in that. But that also gets to a theme here where any kind of neurotechnology or intervention that's helping people be more plastic or learn better or treat a disease, there's this sometimes challenging question: how do we make sure that this is relevant and it works in the long term? That said, I think that there's a lot of room for optimism, because when we learn something and when our brain changes, especially if that's an adaptive as opposed to a maladaptive thing, we're fairly good at, we learn something and it sticks around. And in a lot of fields of neuromodulation for medical purposes, whether it's epilepsy, whether it's stimulation for movement disorders like dystonia, and I think other fields going forward, the stimulation actually gets better over time. If you use an implantable brain stimulator for epilepsy, you're getting way better results a couple years down the road than you are when it's first implanted even. And part of that is, the physician gets better at personalizing the technology and setting it up for that individual. But another part of it is the brain learns, and it learns new patterns of activity. If you're if you're using some kind of intervention like that.
And so this SAINT treatment, this is different from the currently FDA-approved magnetic stimulation. This is a different protocol or a different dosage? How is it different from what's been out there already?
Yeah, so it's a different treatment pattern and technology. You can compare it to there with any kind of technology, there's the physical layer, and that's the bits and bytes that are passing between us right now, and then there's the content, and that's the words we're saying and the thoughts we're exchanging. So that's the core difference is the personalized, targeted treatment technology.
Now that efficacy sounds incredibly good, right? Did you anticipate that level of success? Is that a shocking level?
So to me, I'm the latecomer in the project. I'm now the co-founder and CEO, but this was created by a team at Stanford University, and they dug into what we know about the brain and about depression and about the networks that are involved, and stepped back and tried to engineer every part of that treatment to make it more effective. So those things certainly made sense to them, and I think they were really gratified and surprised, as we are all in this field, because the brain is complicated. That the effect size was so great. Now, for myself as a lifelong neurotechnologist, it's the most profound effect size that I've seen in 2 decades of trying to interact with brains.
Yeah, amazing. So I want to spend the rest of the time that we have turning toward the future, and I just a couple topics I'd like to spend a little time talking about. So, John, many in the public have heard about some of these devices. Certainly, many have heard of Elon Musk talking about whatever it's called, Neuralink and things of this sort. How does one distinguish between the hype and the reality? How does one ensure, as a consumer in the general public, that you are not being taken advantage of or perhaps doing something dangerous if one's interested in experimenting with these kinds of brain stimulations?
Brett and I have argued over this in the past. I was actually did with my colleagues one of the more cited TDCS studies of skill learning in healthy subjects, right? And the effect side was quite dramatic.
Go ahead.
Back in 2009. Now there we were using the TDCS as a tool to ask a scientific question. At least I was. The goal at that time was not simply to say, look, we can make people learn a skill to a greater degree than sham controls. Right? Now I certainly believe whether it's BCI, whether it's non-invasive or invasive brain stimulation, whether it's reopening critical periods pharmacologically, when you're trying to take science, which is very rigorous, and try and make patients better with trials, I'm all for it, right? And I think that is very exciting. What I don't like is when premature consumer versions of these technologies are introduced, right? We don't know enough yet whether we should be doing this in healthy athletes or students. And it's very interesting, right? On the one hand, when people are accused of drug doping in sports, they're immediately, with even minute amounts of drug in their system, they're expelled from the games, right? And yet, at the same time, there's a double standard that when you have the Elon Musks and the others, hey, let's get this technology up and running and enhance humans. Right now, so I am extremely worried about a particular West Coast techno-utopianism that America suffers from, where basically the technological tail wags the biological dog, and the real interest is to try and sell and to try and make money by making people think they're going to be bionic, or they're going to be like the Matrix, or it's going to be like that movie you showed. I think that we have to be super careful and spend a lot more time doing the trials and the science. And yes, when there are diseases which are really refractory to drugs like depression and spinal cord injury now with with spinal cord stimulation and is doing amazing things for walking. Yes, I'm all for that. But I am just, in general, very concerned about the premature jump to consumerism and also the bad faith of claiming that you're doing this for medicine, but really what you're desperately trying to do is get the consumer version, right? And that is a trend that I am very concerned about.
So not to get us into a contentious stance here toward the end, but I'm just wondering, does anything that Brett described here today make you uncomfortable?
There are two ways to be uncomfortable. One is I'm somewhat skeptical about anecdotes of jumping athletes and skiers. I think that to be quite honest, big studies have not really been reproduced of late in TDCS, and there's been a lot of skepticism about it. There's the actual effect size and how reproducible it is, and then whether one should be doing this in healthy people at all. So yes, should we, but when he talks about what they're doing in depression, I think that's amazing, right? There, I think if it's done right and it's really in a group of patients that really are paralyzed by their illness, literally and figuratively in the case of depression, yes. But otherwise, I think when it gets to the healthy subjects, there's a bit of a hype cycle. When you get to disease, I think it becomes more rigorous.
Brett, I have to give you a moment to respond to that.
Yeah, and I think John and I are actually in agreement about a lot of things and a lot of the pitfalls here. And certainly one thing underlying this is it is hard to it's hard to robustly improve anything that a healthy human brain is doing. What's the most complicated, most finely optimized thing that we know of in the entire universe? Well, that's probably the human brain. And when it's operating at peak function, it's hard to have any effect sometimes, and it's certainly hard to have a profound effect. And that's why certainly when you use these technologies to treat disease, there's a network where there's some pathophysiology in that network, and you can identify it, and hopefully you can identify it, or maybe science is on a path toward identifying it, and that gives you a lot of levers that you can then pull when you try to design technologies to address that. Another thing, kind of stepping back to the human performance and consumer applications. One thing that we learned and saw very powerfully at Halo over time, especially, was there's an enormous pull for this kind of technology, and it's very, very hard to communicate to especially to consumers and the world, what exactly, what is this technology? What can it do? What can't it do? What isn't it? And the whole world, in a way, kind of expects it to be more and more powerful and much closer to the Matrix than it actually is. And that was a line that we tried to tread it carefully and be clear about what the technology could and couldn't do. But it was a learning experience as to how powerfully the world wants to interpret any kind of performance neurotechnology as the Matrix, and there's huge pitfalls in that. It puts a lot of responsibility on anybody engaged in the field to try to tread carefully and get it right.
So, Takao, maybe you can also just weigh in, just so everyone has a voice here, on potential consumer applications. I mean, are you bullish on that? Or do you think we need to proceed with great caution? Should be right? I mean, what's your take on where this is going?
I think caution is very much called for. We need to be careful about this hype, as has been mentioned, especially with drugs, because everyone is hoping for that quick fix, pop a pill, learn something new. And there are reasons why these drugs are regulated from a safety point of view. But I assume we'll talk a bit more about the risks of reopening critical periods in a minute. I just want to say that the study I mentioned on absolute pitch was a good lesson for us. It you publish something like that, it goes viral. And to this day, I get emails from musicians or wannabe musicians who want to acquire or want to shake their absolute pitch somehow, when in fact the purpose was a proof of concept that what we've learned from mouse models of brain development does apply to human biology as well. And it's the heartbreaking emails that I get of patients and patient families, people who've had traumatic brain injuries or searching for ways to recover function. That's the audience we are hoping to aid in some way by careful study. And so I too am very, very concerned about a publication or papers that use drugs that are available freely and being misused. And as I just pointed out, even we don't fully understand what the optimal training paradigm is to achieve effects in one domain like pitch versus language. And so there's still some research that definitely needs to happen.
Pretend like it's nothing.
And so why don't we, from
least she
there,
hasn't
take
been
it to where
meowing at
you
all. I mean,
suggested we
she doesn't-
might go, which
she
is
didn't like
when you hear
being
about brain
covered, but-
plasticity in critical periods, at first sight, it
That's it.
sounds,
No, she's just
come
freaked
on,
out.
open them up. I want to get back to my young plastic brain, which could do so much that now is so difficult. What are the potential downsides that research has revealed of reopening these periods?
Yeah, so I'm reminded of a quote by Charles Baudelaire, a French poet, who once said, genius is nothing more nor less than childhood recovered at will. And trying to refine that childlike state. Many artists have talked about this as well. But I think the key in that quote is at will, and the ability to do it in a regulated way. I think there are two answers to your question, what the risks might be. One is at a kind of 30,000-foot philosophical level. We've all gone through critical periods shaping who we are. Our identities are formed in childhood, and our experiences, our cultural background, the languages we speak, the skills we have. If we were to actually be able to reverse all of that, wouldn't we lose ourself? Everybody hopes to add on to who we are, but there is probably a risk if we could truly reverse a critical period. At a more cellular level, we actually know what the risks are at some level. So another kind of break was identified in the early 2000s, which is an extracellular coating around the inhibitory cells I mentioned earlier. And if you enzymatically remove them, which is a very invasive thing you can only do in an animal model, the critical period reopens. This was intriguing and has, of course, yet to be applied to humans because you would need to do something drastic like inject an